Okay, so I'm just going to talk through some of the distinctive features of dramatic form, starting with a brief history, so that you can really make sure that as you're analysing this play, this text, that you are not approaching it in exactly the same way as you would a novel, because a play is not a novel, it is designed entirely differently, and so there are different features that need to be analysed. So when did drama begin? Well, it really depends on what your definition of drama is. In some ways, I think people have been self-expressing and telling stories through acting. Certainly, there's an overlap with oral storytelling and dramatic tradition as well. So it's hard to really pinpoint exactly when plays started circulating. But we do have some big building blocks in that timeline that are worth having a look at. So we begin with the Greeks, and roughly 6th century BC, we have certainly highly public performances. The idea of theatre in a round like this, as you can see, where actors would have been kind of working the crowd and looking around in all kind of directions as they were presenting. And there are a few different specific conventions of Greek theatre too, including a Greek chorus, so a group of people. It's quite scary in that image looking there, but often with masks and costume that make them appear very uniform, and they would like commentate and respond to what was happening on stage, which has this kind of cathartic element. It kind of guides the audience in how they ought to respond as well, and is a sort of a way of exploring that idea of the actors on stage being a stimuli from which we can use as a mirror and respond accordingly, kind of give a sense of whether or not we approve or disapprove of what's happening on stage as well. So there's a sense of learning and judging and engagement. There's an interactivity about theatre of this kind with the Greeks. We do have a few different genres that are mostly used. So in short, there's kind of tragedies and comedies, and that's it. But we also have this other kind of middle ground, the satire. And you can probably see that word S-A-T-Y-R. It doesn't take a genius to kind of make that link between our modern English version of the word satire, which does sit somewhere between comedy and tragedy as well. There's a sense in which we look at our own kind of human folly and we smirk at it at the very least. Moving along in history, theatre, the next kind of big movement in theatrical tradition is Roman theatre. And basically you could almost summarize this movement as, why do something in a simple way if you could do it in the fanciest, most bougie, elitist way possible? So the Romans pick up theatre and basically make it conventional that Latin, a very lofty language for just the educated and elite, is used on stage. So sometimes when we look at older texts, even Shakespearean texts, there's that kind of the question is thrown around, like, do people actually speak like this in their regular everyday lives? And the answer is largely no, that people don't just break out into pentameter and a bunch of other poetic meters as they're talking. So there was this sense in which the Romans unashamedly said theatre should be better than everyday speech. So it's kind of the opposite of realism and the mantra of realism now. The goal was not to be able to relate to the characters in every single particular of their lives. So this is a period of time in which actors start to make a little bit of money. It's seen to be a slightly more respectable way to spend your life, actually, is to be on the stage. And there's an association between kind of fancy, highbrow self-expression and storytelling and the theatre. And then kind of moving along after that, we've kind of got the Middle Ages, and certainly at least in France, so that's kind of where I'm going to be preoccupied with in this little section, is theatre is used most often for religious festivals, annual events. So part of a package, more like a festival of a celebration of multiple art forms kind of coming together. So lots of theatre features dance and song very heavily, and usually some archetypal characters as well start to emerge in popular theatre. So we have almost like what we would see as a cliche now, where people have familiar characters that they can engage with, and then new stories that feature those characters. So a good example of some of these archetypes in this period of time was part of the Feast of Fools. So here's just kind of a little Easter egg for Hunchback of Notre Dame fans, because that story is actually written in this time as well. The Feast of Fools is a religious annual holiday that is taking place where this idea of like kind of life being topsy-turvy and exploring alternate ways of living, I suppose. We have Clopin, who in The Hunchback of Notre Dame is this kind of jester figure. His name, Truffaut, I don't really know how to say it in a good French accent, but literally translates to the fool. And that's an example of one of the archetypal characters that was featured in kind of the theatre of the Middle Ages. So you would have a character like the fool who operated, much like Clopin does in Hunchback of Notre Dame, part narrator, part character. So they're kind of part of the action. They engage with the characters on stage, but there's something objective about them. They seem to be able to stand back and look at all the actors on stage, and they break the fourth wall. So they talk directly to the audience, and they kind of liaise between the theatre world, or the world of the action on stage, and the world of the audience, and narrate that as well. So Clopin, for instance, seems to know a lot about the inner workings of Quasimodo's mind, for instance, in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The Disney version, that is. I'm talking about the Disney version. So I'm just giving a very sweeping overview. You can look up the exact dates for the kind of beginning, middle and end of some of these movements if that's of interest to you. But this is mainly just to give a broader historical context. So picking up from where we were at timeline-wise in the Middle Ages, we're actually just going to now go back to Italy for a second. And Commedia dell'arte is a dramatic tradition of that a certain style of performing that is really captured by that term, and it involves lots of mask wearing. So it builds on the idea of stock characters that were already introduced through history, so that's not a new idea. But this time, Commedia dell'arte really focuses on improvised stories. So it's the idea that the actors are responding impromptu and making it up as they go along, but they're aided by the fact that the audience has certain expectations about how these stock characters will respond. And basically all of the characters can be reduced down to either a lover, a servant, or a master. So they're kind of the broad categories for, I suppose, different classes functioning together as well. And so the predictable storylines, highly comedic. So we often have, just disaster and calamity fall upon the same types of characters, and happy endings fall upon the same types of characters over and over again, and people don't get sick of that. And it's always fresh and it's always new because it's totally impromptu. And all this to say that if you thought Shakespeare was old, just not that old. We kind of enter the English tradition of playwriting and play performance now, a whole bunch of theatrical movements later. So one of the reasons that theatre really takes off in England is partly because Elizabeth I personally really likes it as an art form. So it has a lot of public appeal because it's for everyone. So there's nothing particularly classist about it as it first enters England. The English authorities certainly don't like it because it's rowdy, it's considered vulgar, it's considered a little bit anti-Christian in some ways. And yet it fully takes off partly because Elizabeth commissions personal performances, and playwrights at the time put on very public dress rehearsals. So anyone's welcome to come and watch the dress rehearsals for these, royalty commissioned plays. And that's how it gets off the ground initially. It is short-lived though, so it kind of gets stamped out because of the moral pressure that it's not considered to be a very good thing, a little bit too hedonistic and indulgent, I think, to be considered an upright gentleman's pursuit. At this point, theatre and dramatic tradition has spread across the world, and as you can see, we've had growth from stock characters and certain types of stories needing to be told, and push back in one way and the other about how sentimental those stories are, and what the purpose of storytelling through theatre actually is, whether it's to kind of just involve audiences in a just for fun, highly interactive activity, whether it needs to be high on props, costumes, quite gaudy, whether melodrama is the key feature, stock characters. There's been experimentation with lots of these different forms, and that really lays the groundwork for this boom in Spain between 1590 and 1680. Basically a time in history in which so many plays were produced in Spain, and of all different types, really. Jumping back to England in 1660, so after a short suppression, because plays have this negative reputation as being like highly indulgent and a little bit immoral and leading people astray and leading them to indulge in fantasies that might upset the system and upset their marriages, we have a monarch on the throne who actually loves that about theatre. So loves the kind of cheekiness of it, the sexiness of it, the vulgarity of it, thinks it's really fun and funny. And so theatrical tradition becomes a little bit more mainstream. This is the first time that we have women on stage playing women. They were otherwise played by men dressed up as women. And almost in response to this, you have like theatre purists who are like, no, don't paint theatre as this cheap and nasty tradition. And they resent the rise of these, just for fun, cheap and nasty kind of sexy plays. And so there's, a resurgence of sentimental stories. So a kind of swing in the opposite direction, trying to convey that theatre has this power to convey stories in a way that reforms people, elevates their minds, is good for the world, is good for society. And then almost in response to that, moving forward in time, we have people who are like, stop. It doesn't have to be all doom and gloom and seriousness and real life and moral stories. Let's have acrobats. Let's have really intense sets and elaborate tricks on stage, fireworks, melodrama, lots of masks. So you have kind of a resurgence of some of those older traditions as well. So that's some context of the kind of big movements in theatre that have gone before the 19th and 20th century, which are the two kind of centuries in which we would consider all modern plays to have come out of, really, except for that which comes out next week. And so I thought it might be more helpful to kind of package this whole century, considering that theatre is at this point widespread around the world. And whilst there is a Western tradition, that's what I'm particularly going to focus on today, there are obviously other forms and styles that are still taking off everywhere around the world. So there's nothing to be said about plays in India and the Bollywood tradition that's come out of that, and the African play tradition as well, and certainly the ways that it's been plays have been used by different Indigenous groups as well as a form of storytelling. I'm just consciously saying that I'm focusing on a white Western tradition now, and that is a little bit the unfortunate reality of our curriculum, and also because it has the most specific bearing on the conventions in the play that you're currently studying if you're in my Year 11 English class. So you could kind of summarize the 19th century Western tradition, I think, by saying whatever you do it on purpose. So we kind of have almost wildly different genres at play in the 19th century, and they could be best exemplified by these two movements that I think, styles that are seemingly at odds with one another. So the first is realism, and this should be quite familiar to you because every piece of media that you look at now, like film media, is pretty much saturated in realism. Like it is the dominant style of storytelling on film and on stage that you will see. And I just wanted to just point that out because it is a style. It is not the style. It just happens to be a style that has really endured and permeated our culture. So just addressing it here. Realism is essentially strives for relatable experiences between the audience and the action that's taking place on stage. So it almost rests upon this principle that emotional engagement, the greater your ability to empathize with the characters on stage, the more likely you are to receive the powerful message that the play has to communicate. So once again, just pointing out that that is not an objectively true statement, but it just almost is the philosophy at work that underpins realism. This idea that the goal is to really hook the audience in by allowing them to really see a mirror of themselves on stage. and also this idea that I can build empathy for people in different circumstances from me by creating characters that at least share this really common humanity enough that I can, I might not empathize with their exact situation that they're in, but I can empathize with that particular feeling and, broader experiences like the experience of feeling rejected or the experience of feeling alone or the experience of feeling really cared for by a loved one. Those kind of more universal human experiences are played out on stage. So that's realism, this idea of like it's real and quite similar to my own life in some ways. And then expressionism is quite the opposite of that. And when I say it's the opposite of that, I mean it almost philosophically is at odds with that. So it almost doesn't believe that the chief way in which you can communicate a powerful message to the audience is by just meeting them where they're at and engaging with them in the same world as they're already in. In fact, it's almost the opposite. It like has this more transcendental truth-telling about it. It's the idea that true reality or cannot quite be expressed in the kind of pedestrian, mundane world that we live in now. So it kind of almost sees art as a way of filling that void. And I guess the way that I could describe this is twofold. So if that really doesn't make sense to you, consider it this way. If you ever had a feeling that's so strong and you try and describe what that feeling is like, but words don't really seem to do it justice. That's almost the same thing as what expressionist artists would feel and relate to, this idea that the language that I have is almost this limiting factor in expressing my human experiences, and that really conveying my truth requires things that go beyond natural human language or natural human acting. And so I need to show something that's symbolic and a little bit wackier in order to really get truth across. And a visual arts example of this would be like an expressionist painter. So here's just a little excerpt from Starry Night, which you definitely know. It's like probably the most famous painting in the world by Vincent van Gogh. And you can see in his style of art that his preoccupation is not so much with trying to recreate exactly what the night sky looked like that night and get all the realistic, naturalistic details about it. But instead, it's like he's trying to convey what it felt like it looked like, if that makes sense. So there's this sense in which the emotions associated with that experience feel like a deeper truth than the practical details of it. And so I'm trying to convey that with symbol or convey that in kind of alternate ways. And that feels actually more truthful and more right. So they're kind of like two competing ideas about how theatre is best expressed, and both of them are kind of existing concurrently in the 19th century. And then as theatrical tradition then evolves again into the 20th century, I almost see that those two different pillars, so your realism and expressionism, almost manifest themselves in a more extreme version of those two art forms, really, or genres. So naturalism, and like timeline wise, there's a lot of overlap here. Lots of this is emerging in the 19th century as well, but it's just cleaner to categorize it like this. Naturalism is the most extreme version of realism, in that the idea is to completely restore the fourth wall so that the audience has this almost voyeuristic experience of just peering into somebody's house. So most of the stories are like domestic affairs. So stories that take place entirely in one room, in one house. So you don't have the audience suspending disbelief as sets change and going along for the ride that circumstances have changed and we're now in a different time and a different place. None of that. There's this sense in which you are watching just 2 hours straight of real life, which might sound entirely boring to you, but I think it really gets into this kind of creepy curiosity that we have to really just see the way that people actually live. And so it often depicts people in situations where they're caught in a difficult relationship or there's tension in a family, something like that. So real life issues and real life complications, incredibly, poignant, beautiful, but understated dialogue, much the way that people would actually talk. No sense of monologue. People are only saying what must be said, and a lot more is being communicated by just their actions, because let's face it, as people are walking around the house, they're not usually monologuing to themselves about how they're feeling and giving an invisible force some context as to what's happening in their life in the grand scheme. We just get to see real time 2 hours of someone's life, and we watch through their body language and the way they are when they're with different people who kind of come in and out of that room. We can fill in the blanks about what their relationships are like, for instance. So that's naturalism. It's highly directed by the playwright. The playwright has a lot of control, and even things such as where things ought to be placed on the stage, so that things are presented almost exactly so, and the message doesn't get misconstrued. And then in the other camp, you have, so this is expressionism, I suppose. You have even more indulgence in kind of nihilist. The existential crisis becomes the preoccupation of that evocative emotional art. So a yearning to fill the void and to tell my truth about how I'm feeling and what my experience as a human being is like, if that's the message I'm trying to get across. And I really wholeheartedly believe that the best way to do that is not to just tell you in just plain words, in my plain native language, how I'm feeling and that I'm feeling depressed. It's actually just to make you sit there and watch me, as this picture might suggest, vacuum a desert for 2 hours, like to kind of put the audience through that absurd experience. And that, what happens on stage is one whole powerful symbol for something usually filled with dread about the world. So it's they're kind of like exaggerated versions, I suppose, of realism and expressionism. So theatre, much like all art in the 21st century, has kind of a nod to many different times in its own history and tradition. So there is a sense in which playwrights today and people in this industry can put on a play from any time period and celebrate what is unique and fun and meritorious about all of those different traditions in history. There are a couple of particular things that are notable about 21st century theatre. One is, I think, a leaning towards trying to break down the fourth wall, so kind of anti-naturalistic tendencies. We tend to want more audience engagement in the 21st century and view theatre as a vehicle for potentially exploring social issues and encouraging people to, there's a form of therapy in theatre. So theatre has been used as a way of digesting social issues, as a way of involving people of various communities that are disadvantaged in some way, building confidence. We kind of recognise that involvement in theatrical tradition has all these awesome impacts and byproducts for people, that it's a real community building exercise to be part of an ensemble, and so trying to utilise that as much as possible. So there have been some traditions, where theatre has been used as a form of therapy for people, and there's some really cool ways in which theatre gives representation and a voice to otherwise marginalised groups. So an example of this is Milk Crate Theatre, that put on performances that showcase stories of the homeless community, and people who are homeless, play characters that of their own invention. It's kind of up to them whether or not that character is a direct portrayal of themselves or not, but it does give them firstly a chance to showcase their story, to be involved in something, to connect with other people in the homeless community, to connect with people in the theatre community, to build kind of relationships, and also to then put on their performance so that other people can see them actually and just see their stories and hear from them. So that's a kind of very 21st century example. So how is this relevant to you, and why would you care about, theatrical tradition that's not in the immediate text that you look at? Well, firstly, I think by looking at what something isn't, we get a real sense of what it is. And I think it is important to understand dramatic tradition over this time to just see how much of just a almost fad and trend and moment it is that realism is having, because everything that you will watch, like every Oscar-winning movie, every TV show that you're watching, every novel even that you're reading is based on this assumption that realism is the dominant, style that you write in. So even if you're reading something that is a fantasy story, emotional realism in our time and place in history is considered kind of just the key to good writing. The idea that even if I'm not in the same situation as these characters exactly, I can understand why they're making the decisions that they're making, and we have heaps in common. And therefore, because I can see myself in the character, therefore it's good writing, and therefore it's engaging to me. Which, when you think about it, is very narcissistic, that we need to see ourselves represented in stories in order to engage with them. And I mean, I write here the Hollywood problem. I really just mean that Hollywood, in its time in history, has come along and really transformed acting into put it in a particular box. And this is one of the reasons why realism has taken off so much. So if you were thinking to yourself, oh, who is the best Hollywood actor? Probably the key point that you would consider is how realistic are they when they act? Like, I didn't even realize that they were acting, like it was like a real person was responding to that. That's some of the metrics that you might actually impose on the actor to say, this is like good acting equals good realism. And I just want to point out that that's not a thing. Like, that's not an objective truth. Realism is not the only way to be a good actor, and it's not the only way to write plays or movies. So I just want to point that out, because if you're in my year 11 class at the moment, the play that we're studying is a really good example of realism. Like, it isn't trying to be anything except realism, and that is the main vehicle that it's using in order to get its powerful message across. And you can actually talk about realism as a conscious choice of the playwright to write in that style, whereas you might have dismissed that and just thought that's just a given, that things are written in a realistic style. But it's not a given. Like, he actually could have written that story chiefly through symbols, chiefly through kind of like absurd dances that take place on a stage, integration with music, with flashing lights and bizarre sound effects, to try and give you a sense of the chaos of whatever message he was trying to communicate. But he chose not to do that. He chose to give a very kind of naturalistic, realistic setting, dialogue, plot to all of it. Like, everything is quite understated, and that's a deliberate choice that he's using. So you actually need to talk about that choice as a feature of the text. It's not a given. And this leads me to a kind of next topic, which is, what do you pick apart and analyze in a play? So if realism isn't a given, and there's lots of different ways in which I could choose to express meaning, what are the kind of techniques involved in that expression, and how do I pull them apart? And the best way to think about that is actually to kind of systematically work through the elements of drama, I think. That's the kind of safest way to make sure that you've really exhausted all of the components that go into a play. So the elements of drama are here on the screen. They're role and character, situation, language, tension, atmosphere, focus, symbol, place, time, structure, sound, movement, space, rhythm, and moment. And I've just grouped them here in 4 groups because I do see like there's overlap everywhere. All of these elements interact with one another. That's kind of the point, is that drama is quite difficult to separate into discrete elements. The magic and the power of drama is actually the cohesion of all of these things working together. So it's almost impossible to talk about one without talking about a couple of others. But here are 4 different groupings that I think can be helpful to tackle together, to think about role, character, situation, and language as one element. they're three different elements, but one kind of category within the elements of drama. And the reason I put them together, for instance, to begin with, is because they are the things that the playwright has the most control over. So they're the things that are most embedded in the text itself. So if you're looking at words on a page, role and character, situation and language are mostly just derived from the text directly. And then we kind of impose upon that place, time, structure, and sound. They're things that are often dictated by the actual physical environment in which you have to stage a play. So the way in which your sound works, how long your play runs for, the actual location, the stage, all of those things are either a deliberate director's choice or they're kind of imposed upon you by the constraints that you have. And then movement, space, rhythm, and moment tend to be things that are more to do with the actor's relationship with the character that they're playing, their particular style, and also actor to actor relationships as well. So finding that kind of like rhythm and sense of pace, and it's fluid, but what is rehearsed there, and then tension, atmosphere, focus, and symbol, I think are things that the audience is more involved with. So there's a lot of overlap, and these aren't neat categories, but if you're trying to think of it in layers, I will make another video hopefully soon that will unpack each one of these, but also talk about those categories. I'll organize them by categories, and I think they're helpful layers to approach with. Kind of start with the text, what's plain in the text, what is added, what meaning is added by looking at the physical space and the direction of the director, what meaning is added when you think about who the individual actor is playing those roles and the kind of actor to actor relationship, and then what impact does the audience also have on the meaning of the play.